Welcome to episode 51 of Birthwords. In today's episode, we'll be talking about being reflective about the language that we use.
Welcome to Birthwords. Words are powerful. What are you doing with yours? In this podcast, birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sara invites you to be intentional, reflective, and empowering with your language as we come together to honor those who give birth. The work of Birthwords is to elevate the language surrounding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Welcome to today's episode. We are going to talk about the importance of being reflective about the language that we use. And I've kind of chosen these three key words for the work of Birthwords: reflective, intentional, and empowering. So this will be the first in a three-part series where we'll talk about what it looks like to be each of those three things with our words: reflective, intentional, and empowering. And on the Birthwords website, it says, the language we use is shaped by social and cultural influences, and in turn shapes our society and culture. Learn to unpack the implicit assumptions and beliefs that accompany your words. This is our job with being reflective in our language, to learn to unpack the implicit assumptions and beliefs that accompany your words. You may find yourself saying things at random times, wondering, where did I pick up that phrase? Or realizing maybe I don't agree with the way that I said that, but it's just kind of the term that I've heard. I feel like this comes up in pregnancy and birth a lot. And recent events, as we talked about 2 episodes ago with the murder of George Floyd and other police brutality instances that have been building over the years, have brought attention to the need to be reflective in all areas of our lives. Many Americans and other nationalities at this time are being called upon and are encouragingly taking the opportunity to be reflective about their language, their attitudes, their behaviors, and consider how they're influenced, consciously or not, by racism and by white supremacist ideology. And I've been doing some work the past few weeks more heavily in this area of unpacking where my belief systems come from, what little hints and inklings of white supremacist ideology are implicit in some of the things that I say and do, and how I interact regularly, and how I can root those out of myself and work towards creating a world of justice and peace for all people. It's a big pill to swallow, and it can be difficult and overwhelming. It's not a work that can be done in a few days or a few weeks, but it's one that I'm committing to continuing to do personally and professionally over the coming days, weeks, months, and years. So let's talk a little bit about a few instances of language in this situation. We talked about in episode 49 that racial inequality is apparent in many aspects of our lives, and birth is not exempt from that. We talked about the disparities between maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates in the U.S. Of Black birth givers versus others giving birth. The rate for Black birth givers is 3 times the maternal mortality rate for white and Hispanic birth givers. Indigenous peoples also have a disproportionately high maternal mortality rate. And the infant mortality is about twice for Black babies. And this is a really disheartening statistic and something difficult to come to terms with, and something that we all need to be working to make better. So some language that's been used around the events and movements of the past few weeks, and of course many years, but that have really come into the media spotlight the last few weeks. The phrase Black Lives Matter. Some have been countering it with the phrase All Lives Matter. And their explanations abound of why that is harmful and not helpful, why it attempts perhaps to be unifying, but instead turns away an important injury in our system or inherent flaw of our system that we need to be working on specifically, that Black lives in the birth space, in pregnancy, and in many other realms of our society are more at risk than other lives. And this is a time to be focused on righting that injustice. A couple of analogies that I've come across on social media are, if your spouse or partner is hurting and comes to you and says, "Do you love me?" you don't respond by saying, "I love everyone." Whether that is true or not, the fact that an individual is hurting and comes to you saying, "Do you love me?" requires an individual response. And similarly, as the Black community comes forward saying we are hurting, our response is to say, "You matter," not "everyone matters." Though that is true, the response to say, "You are hurting and you matter," recognizes the individuality and importance of that need. Another analogy I've seen is that if you have a broken arm and you go to the doctor and you say, "My arm is broken," the doctor doesn't respond. All bones are important. All bones matter, right? Because you're coming for your arm. It's the broken one and the one that needs attention. So we are taking this opportunity to turn our attention to be reflective about the systems that are in place that oppress people of color and how we play a role in those systems and what we can do to make it better. Ava DuVernay said and pointed out that the system is not broken. The system was built this way. Whether that is the system of law enforcement or education or obstetrics, many systems in the United States and in other countries are built upon racial injustice. Many of these systems were built around slavery or exploiting Black people. Obstetrics specifically was built upon the exploitation of Black women. So unfortunately, the system is not broken. The system is functioning the way that it was built to function. Now, no, it's not broken. Yes, it needs to be changed, dismantled, and rebuilt in a way that is not taking advantage of marginalized groups of people and individuals. So as we talk about being reflective with our language, let's also be reflective about our actions and how we can unpack the implicit assumptions and beliefs that come along with our words and the things that we do. And let's all commit to making a change for a better world. So as we continue to move forward in this time, we're being increasingly reflective about racism in ourselves, in institutions, in society as a whole. I am committing to regularly make resources available through Birthwords on Facebook and Instagram. Follow me there so that you can see other people that are doing this work that I'll point you towards and resources that I am part of creating. Follow there. I will continue to regularly make resources about anti-racism available so that we can all continue to do this important work and address the hurts that are in our system, in our society, and in ourselves. And I also invite you, as we have since the beginning of Birthwords, whether you are a birth giver or a birth worker, to continue in all realms of your work to be reflective about your speech regarding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. It's something that we've addressed in past episodes and will continue to address for birth givers and birth workers alike. Let's take a look back on some of the past episodes where we've talked about being reflective about our speech during pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. In episodes 8 and 17, we talked about underlying beliefs and assumptions, that you can tell somewhat of where someone is coming from through unpacking the things that they say about birth, pregnancy, and what operates underneath. What's their driving assumption for the way that we speak? Complexities 1 and Complexities 2, episodes 8 and 17. In episode 14, Healing, we talked about being reflective with your language in the postpartum period. Heidi Piper, a fellow doula, talked about her postpartum experience and how some of the language that she was faced with during that time was difficult in making the space and bringing attention to the difficulties she was facing postpartum, and how we can be reflective about the language that we use when we're supporting people in the postpartum period, as we're reflecting on our own postpartum experiences and as we're preparing for them. Let's be reflective about the language that we use and if it's addressing our current situations. Episode 18, we talked about power with Rebecca Decker. She drew attention to some of these phrases that come out of obstetrics that, again, are very patriarchal and put the power in the birth-giving process in the hands of men. So give that a listen. And while it wasn't explicitly brought up during that episode, it's interesting to consider, and if you do some more research about the history of obstetrics, how minoritized populations specifically are harmed by the power roles that began in the early days of obstetrics. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, Black women specifically were brutally taken advantage of in the early days of obstetrics. And some of the terms that come from those times still stick with us. So it's important to stop and say, where's that term coming from? Do I agree with the implicit assumptions that come along with it? Episode 20, we talked about consent and what the language of true informed choice looks like. In episode 22, we talked about the language of infertility, and the guest there, Margaret Quinlan, talked about the history, again, a bit about the history of obstetrics and the history of infertility, and how sometimes the language we use comes across as sounding like you're doing it wrong. Let's be reflective to not do those sorts of things. In episode 24, we talked about the word deliver, and we were reflective about the use of that word and where it puts power. In episode 27, we did some linguistic decomposition of some words to be reflective about what some common words used in pregnancy and birth, if we take them apart, what are we really saying with them, and is that what we want to be saying? In episode 33, I did a discourse analysis of a segment of a popular pregnancy book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and was reflective about the language in that excerpt. In episode 39, we talked about some common pregnancy colloquialisms and why it might be wise to be a little bit more reflective about the ones that we use to truly give honor to those who give birth and those preparing to give birth, when sometimes our colloquialisms are not apt to be as giving as much honor as is deserving. And in episode 45, we talked about metaphor. What lies underneath the way that you talk about birth? Do we talk about labor as if it's a machine? Do we talk about breasts as if they're bottles? Do we talk about birth givers as if they're inherently flawed or broken? Or do we use words that reflect the awe-inspiring, incredible work that they're doing as they prepare for and bring forth life and care for that new life in the postpartum period and care for their own lives as instruments of life? So we'll continue this conversation, and like I said in upcoming episodes, talk about, okay, after we've been reflective about our language, how do we then choose to be intentional and choose language that points us towards positive change? And then we'll talk about specifically choosing to be empowering with our words. So again, I'm going to close with this quote about the description of what it means to be reflective with our language. And I'd encourage you to go back and listen to some of those episodes and to pause and think when you are speaking to somebody about pregnancy, birth, or if you're in that space, being reflective about the words that you use, and consider whether you are unintentionally carrying implicit assumptions and beliefs that are not what you want them to be. It can be a little painful or awkward or embarrassing to reflect back on things that I've said during conversations with neighbors or friends or clients during pregnancy or birth that maybe didn't come out quite the way I wanted them to, but I think it's an important part of the growing process. And again, as we work to overcome and dismantle and root out systemic and individual racial prejudices, that work is also uncomfortable but critical. And I invite everybody to be reflective about the language that we're using. And again, here's that quote. The language we use is shaped by social and cultural influences, and in turn shapes our society and culture. Learn to unpack the implicit assumptions and beliefs that accompany your words. So I invite you to do that important work this week and in the many weeks to come. Have a good one.
If you're interested in sharing your ideas or experiences on the podcast, go to birthwords.com. If you're liking what you hear, please leave a review on your podcast app. For more resources about language for a better birth, subscribe to the monthly newsletter at birthwords.com and follow Birthwords on Instagram and Facebook.